But another big story we're tracking, Middle East conflict. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has declined to give a timeline for the U.S. military war on Iran, saying it was up to President Donald Trump to give the length of the military campaign against Tehran. Briefing the media in Virginia, Hegseth said that Trump had made extensive efforts with Tehran to enter into negotiated agreement into the run-up of the start of the military operation on Saturday. But Iranian authorities declined. And this comes after last year's Operation Midnight Hammer had devastated Iran's nuclear infrastructure, reducing key elements of its program to the ruins.
Last June, Operation Midnight Hammer obliterated their nuclear program to rubble. Afterward, we told them plainly, that's it, now make a deal. They arrogantly refused. We said, rebuild it, and we'll stop you again, this time far worse. Well, President Trump, Secretary Rubio, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, they bent over backwards for real diplomacy, offering pathway after pathway to peace. I watched it. I was there. They tried over and over and over again earnest attempts at peace. The former regime had every chance to make a peaceful and sensible deal. But Tehran was not negotiating. They were stalling, buying time to reload their missile stockpiles and restart their nuclear ambitions. Their goal, hold us hostage, threatening to strike our forces. Well, President Trump doesn't play those games. And as Secretary Rubio said after the Maduro raid, if you don't know, now you know. President Trump puts America and Americans first. He doesn't hesitate, and neither do our troops.
Right, so let's get more on this. Speak to SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who is live for us in New York. Sherwin, it's a busy time, and I know we're trying to make sense of what's transpiring in real time, but perhaps you can tell us what some of the core messaging was following that briefing by General Dan Kane and Pete Hegseth. But also Congress expected to assert its war powers authority today. What exactly is happening in Capitol Hill? What does this mean now going forward?
Yeah, a complex scenario and many things to analyze and get into, particularly in the aftermath of that briefing by Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, joined by the General Dan Kane, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And essentially the message is that this is a long-standing commitment. They don't know what the end game is here in terms of timelines, Liesl. And that they're sending more forces to the region, which tells you that there is an escalation coming here, given one imagines the defense that the Iranians have been putting up here, right? 4 U.S. service members have now been confirmed dead. This raises political questions in the United States, particularly in the context that Donald Trump did not seek authorization from the United States Congress, something that is going to be playing itself out in the days ahead. A number of congressional lawmakers, both Republican and Democrat, want to assert and reassert Congress's authority in terms of what is known as a war powers resolution. The U.S. Constitution gives that mandate to the United States Congress. And so you're going to see this battle play itself out between the unilateral actions of the executive here and what congressional lawmakers are seeking to achieve here. They want to restrain the president's engagement here militarily with Iran, while also recognizing that perhaps there were not many good actors within the Iranian government or regime, right? They have a dismal and appalling human rights record, and that seems to be this balancing act that you're hearing from some lawmakers criticizing perhaps the president's actions here, but also recognizing that they were perhaps not good actors in Iran, just given the high death toll most recently that we saw in terms of those protests, the protesters that were protesting economic conditions, dire economic conditions in Iran. So essentially, the four service members have been confirmed dead. We also have that report that friendly fire from Kuwaiti air defenses shooting down 3 F-15 jets, but all 6 service air crew in those jets were able to get out of the plane before they crashed, evacuate, perhaps is the word. And so we are watching very closely now, Liesl, to see how Congress is going to assert itself here. There is a war powers debate that is going to be ongoing. But in terms of where we go from here, I don't think the American government essentially knows what the end game is here. in terms of, is it regime change? Is it dismantling their nuclear weapons program? Because apparently that was already achieved in last year's strike on the nuclear facilities. And if you hear from senior Democrats on the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Mark Warner, he makes the point, Liesl, that our intelligence assessment has suggested that there was no imminent threat from Iran and that Tehran was a decade away from building missiles that could reach the United States. So the reasoning for this action, I think Congress is going to see clarity on that from the president and certainly his executive today.
Well, we're also trying to ascertain the tensions between legislative and executive powers at this point and what's happening there. But even if we're looking at if this war powers resolution is passed, what's the practical impact that would have on the U.S. military operations if we are trying to imagine what that scenario then looks like?
Well, the stated goal from members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, that are seeking to assert Congress's war powers authority here is to restrain the president. They want to understand what the goal is here. What the cost is going to be to the United States. Understand that the U.S. Congress has the power of the purse in the USA. And there's a financial element here. And then there's also the political question, Liesl, in terms of the number of casualties that are now being suffered on both sides. You talk about the 4 service members that have died, U.S. service members, multiple injuries, we understand, in addition to those deaths. You talk about the 550-plus people that have already been killed in Iran, dozens, we understand, being killed in Israel. Congress is seeking to understand what the end game is here, right? The Israeli ambassador during a UN Security Council emergency session on Saturday said the following in terms of what the objectives are here. They say they want to eliminate the threat posed by the Iranian regime, dismantle its nuclear program, destroy its ballistic missile production capabilities, neutralize the Navy threats, and break the terror proxy network. But just to go back to Pete Hegseth's press conference where he talked about how the Iranians were stalling and they were not necessarily negotiating in good faith, understand that there was a last round of talks between the United States and Iran in Geneva on Thursday, and it is being mediated by Oman. And Oman's foreign minister on Friday said the following. He went on X, firstly denouncing the U.S. action, said he was very dismayed. He said active and serious negotiations have yet again been undermined and the war does not serve the interests of the United States. He also told CBS News this: I am confident, and in my assessment of the way the talks are going, I can see that peace is within reach. The single most important achievement, I believe, is that the agreement that Iran will never, ever have a nuclear material that will create a bomb. This is something completely new. It really makes the enrichment argument less relevant because now we are talking about zero stockpiling. So the Omani foreign minister is undercutting what Pete Hegseth is saying here in terms of that the Iranians were not negotiating in good faith. The mediator to those negotiations has articulated that progress was being made, and this act of war by the United States undercut that ongoing diplomatic process.
Sherwin, has there been response from EU allies, perhaps with regards to permission granted for their bases as well? Then obviously also looking at Israel's response at this point, given the dynamics in the US, China, Russia, anything to echo there?
Well, the implications for everybody, the EU, the Asians, the Chinese, the Africans, if you get oil or liquefied natural gas through the Strait of Hormuz, there is concern that oil prices and gas prices are going to shoot up because the Iranians have said they will not shut down the Strait of Hormuz, but that still remains a clear and present danger just in terms of energy costs. Look, the EU statements are really walking this fine line between not condemning the U.S. action because they believe that there were bad actors in Iran, poor human rights record, over and over again, particularly most recently, the attacks you saw against protesters in Iran. So there is no good vibe, if you will, between Western leaders and the Iranian government. What the EU is now saying is they want to see a de-escalation here. They want to see a political off-ramp here. They believe that negotiations should resume. But as you're seeing, there is a military escalation. More troops are going to the region. That's certainly what you heard from Dan Kane, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff here. So where we go is anybody's guess right now, Liesl.
More questions and answers, Sherwin. Thank you for telling us about what is currently transpiring. We'll monitor that alongside you as the clock ticks on. There's Sherwin Bryce-Pease, our correspondent in the U.S. This is bring up to speak. Congress expected to assert its war powers authority today. What the tensions mean between the White House and Congress itself is one that we will be monitoring.